Hello, so this video is going to provide a breakdown of Carol Sanford's book, The Regenerative Business. And we're going to go through it step by step, and we're going to begin with talking a bit about who Carol Sanford is. She is a pretty big figure in the business world, also in the business studies academic world. She's written very many articles. She has a blog on Medium. She has a Substack. She also has books. She's written around 7 books, which is a big deal. So that's a big thing. And she is also a CEO. She has her own company. She is a teacher. She's taught at various universities, places like Stanford, as well as public Ivies. And she is, most of all, a thought leader. She's considered a thought leader in um, understanding systemic business change. We're going to get to what that means, but she's helped various businesses and executives bring about significant, long lasting changes in their business, which have helped them grow and become innovative. She also calls herself a positive contrarian. And a positive contrarian is just anybody who disagrees but always has a real productive reason to disagree. So she's someone who calls herself this, and when we get to the end of this video or this lecture, you could say, you'll understand because she goes against many of the common business practices that are deemed as standard, or that all businesses should be taking up. So this is mostly why her ideas will seem a bit unfamiliar. They will seem like they do contradict everything that so far you might have read for about business and how businesses should be run. So, The Regenerative Business is a book that has it's sort of broken down into various chapters. So you have your introduction, a pretty standard format. You have your chapters, and then you just have an epilogue. And we're going to go through each one just to highlight the key concepts in each of these various sections. Um, Apart from The Regenerative Business, you can see that she's written books called The Responsible Business, The Responsible Entrepreneur, No More Feedback, Indirect Work. So you can tell from the title as well that she has a certain ethic with which she kind of approaches her work, but also that she is going against the grain. So No More Feedback, that's a title that speaks for itself. Um, so ultimately, if we were to kind of talk about what Stanford is trying to do, is that she's trying to tell the audience in her book, and in any kind of article you read of hers, any podcast you listen to, is that we need to rethink what it really means to grow a business. We need to rethink what innovation means. We need to rethink how we treat our employees and how we see our employees, and mostly how we can connect our businesses to society. So the only way to connect businesses to society is not through specific programs or community service endeavors, but she has a more in-depth understanding of that. And so ultimately, if there are 4 things she wants people to rethink, it is these 4 things. And so then the big question comes up, right, of what even is regeneration? Because regeneration is not something that you usually see in business books. It's something that comes up in biology. Um, you might recall cell regeneration. That's a very popular topic. Um, and so it's kind of strange to see it in the business landscape. But usually, regeneration is, if you kind of think about it, it usually is just something that continues to grow in some way, or something that is alive, right? Anything that regenerates is something that is alive. And this is the most important concept to understand, because regeneration is something that allows people to evolve, allows people or anything that is alive to evolve. Um, and it is a process, according to Stanford, through which people go through, institutions can go through this so that they evolve. And they evolve to do in order to reach what stage? They evolve in order to reach a stage of potential, a stage of their potential, or they reach a stage of their own capacity. So I suppose stage is not the correct word then. The correct word is that they evolve to reach a certain capacity in themselves. They reach a capacity that allows them to realize their inherent potential. So their inherent potential. And she says that every person, organization, living system has unique essence to it, and that regeneration just sort of helps these living systems develop and contribute to the other systems around them. And this can seem like a very complicated concept, but ultimately it's just regeneration for Stanford is something that people and institutions go through so they can evolve. which allows them to reach a certain capacity so that they can act out of their inherent potential. So, according to her, everybody has an inherent potential, and this is important. Regeneration is important in a world that is constantly changing. Now, if you have questions like how do I grow my business, how do I innovate, how do I engage my employees, and how do I, in all of this, make sure that I'm connected to society authentically? So you can do all of these two things and not contribute to these two things. And usually, this book is for people who care about people and they care about society and they care about doing the right thing, doing the thing that is sustainable. So, for anyone with these queries, this book is a great read. Now, again, coming back to the book. So, if I were to break down the book, I would say that it has 11 chapters, and it's basically, you can break down the chapters into 3 sections. And the first section kind of works towards understanding what is regenerative work design. We'll get to what this means, but this sort of answers, why regeneration matters, what it exactly is, how it addresses business challenges in the 21st century. The second part focuses a lot on, okay, how do we assess businesses? How do we assess where our business is at and then implement this work design into our business? And the third part just sort of goes through the 5 phases that a business needs to pass through in order to become regenerative. So this is how the book is broken down. And so you could say it's more of an instructional book, but it also alongside is quite conceptual. So there is a fine balance between those two things. So ultimately, the question that this book keeps coming back to again and again in each section is, how should a business run? So keep this question in mind because that is the question that is being answered throughout. Now, if we come to the introduction is called disruptive innovation, and it focuses on this concept that, whenever we think about innovation, right? Innovation usually means doing things faster in a cheaper way and ultimately making things better. And for Sanford, innovation matters, but she says you can't have innovation without disruption, which means that we need to rethink the system. So we need to rethink the way that the entire system works. If we're trying to innovate something, we need to rethink the entire system in which that thing belongs. So it creates an entirely new kind of value, and it doesn't just lead to improvement. So innovation usually leads to improvement, but disruption leads to creating more value in that business. So an example that she gives is that, if let's say we want to improve the taxi system in a city, now we could innovate by making better apps or having cheaper rides, right? But if we really want to disrupt, right, if we really want to add value, we need to rethink transportation altogether as a whole. So we need to rethink things like shared mobility. We need to rethink why there can't be fewer cars and who gets to own different kinds of cars, who gets to be able to purchase one and have access to that. So this is sort of the main idea here. And if we talk about disruption specifically in the context of a business, disruption basically just means, the introduction of a new product or a way of working that has the effect of overturning existing patterns within that particular industry. So disruption innovations arise when a company looks beyond what currently exists. So you're looking beyond what currently exists, right? And you're trying to accomplish what you want to exist instead. So you're trying to see what others can't see. And that is the entire idea here. Not just about improvement, but that you want to add something to the industry that hasn't been done before and that can add value as well. Now, there are 2 things to kind of consider here. The first is going to be work design. So now these are all components of understanding regenerative businesses. So these are all aspects that a regenerative business will have. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is just defining certain terms, and because they'll help reorient how one thinks about their own business. So the clear links won't show up in the beginning right now, but as we move forward, you'll kind of see everything coming together. So don't worry if you're not understanding how everything links together yet. So if you come to work design, now work design basically, you could say, is the way in which people work in your business. Pretty simple. How do we work? How is work set up in your organization, right? So let's say we use Rome. We use Rome, and we meet on Rome from 8 to 3 for various number of hours, right? So this is our work design. Our work design is remote, and our work design is dependent on this particular app, right? This is part of our work design. And according to Sanford, the kind of work design that you have is going to determine how people develop their capacities and capabilities. So how people develop their capacities and capabilities is directly linked to the kind of work design your organization has. Um, so, so overall, you need to design new ways to work, and this is how it kind of links back to disruptive innovation. That if you want disruptive innovation, you need to figure out new ways to work as well alongside all that. So you need to restructure how you work. So yeah, we can think about disruptive innovation all day, but on a practical level, if we want to carry that out, we need to make sure that how we work, the design of our work, it aligns with that. So this is just the initial concept. Now, if all of this is so wonderful and this is the way to go, this is how a business should be run, why don't we hear about these concepts? Why haven't we necessarily ever heard of disruptive innovation, right? Or work design in the books we've read or the companies that we admire? And according to Stanford, the main reason is mindset. So according to her, you need a certain kind of mindset to be able to have a regenerative business. So you need to, one, see yourself as part of a living system, that business doesn't exist or organizations don't exist in these vacuums, right? The second thing is that you need to recognize that you have an unconscious attachment to um, certain habitual patterns of thinking. So you may be stuck in borrowed ideas, right? That you're following certain business books to the T, right? Or we're not aware of our mindsets. And she says that in order to become a regenerative business, you need to be aware of what you're thinking and your mindset and how it affects how you think about your business, and you need to make yourself conscious of those effects. So this will help one create the thinking that you need for this business practice. So overall, a mindset is just a lens. It's a lens through which we make sense of the world. And this kind of mindset that she talks about, a regenerative mindset, is completely in contrast to what she calls a machine mindset. So a machine mindset, we've all heard of it, right? That it's a mindset that helps people build efficient systems for businesses, but it leads to dehumanized workplaces where people are not seen as human, and it can lead to damaged ecosystems and it can lead to loss of local cultures. And so for Sanford, a regenerative mindset in the business world is very rare, but it's not something that's impossible to accomplish. But for her, this kind of mindset helps build new social systems and helps build new capabilities. And she focuses a lot on democracy in her work. She ascribes to that political view. So when you read her work, you'd also see her saying that this kind of mindset also leads to democratic institutions. So one doesn't have to subscribe to that necessarily, but that's sort of her approach. So that word might come up in her work if you end up reading it. So after all of these are sort of the fundamental concepts that you need to know about before we move on to chapter 1. So chapter 1 is all about going beyond the concept of training and actually developing people. So it's all about people, this chapter. So how can you develop your people? And she makes this interesting contrast that, I mean, she first has this understanding of people that creativity and innovation are inherent in human beings, that when people have a place to express themselves in useful ways, they provide the necessary energy for businesses to be successful. And she says that any business that is regenerative taps into creativity and innovation. So this is sort of the process of developing people needs to be built into the design of a business and how that business works. So for her, it's a fundamental and necessary concept that is needed for an intelligent organization. So if you want an intelligent organization, you focus on developing your people. Now, for her, the idea is that a lot of companies are built on outdated ideas about human nature, and that's what she kind of calls training. So the idea or the concept of training isn't necessarily bad, but what she calls or defines as training isn't something she thinks is good. So for instance, you could just as well be developing people and calling it training. So it's not so much the terminology, but what it means. And she gives an example that most managers, they believe people need to be stimulated with incentives and rewards, in order to grow. They do become motivated, but they don't really develop, because this isn't to motivate people, to give them incentives, for her is not the same as developing your people. Developing people means that you're allowing people to fully express themselves, and you're focusing on critical thinking, you're focusing on personal mastery, you're focusing on business acumen. So, and she backs all of this up with a certain kind of scientific research as well. So human nature is sort of at the core of these ideas that she's talking about. And she says that this is backed by science, that everyone has an inherent capacity not only to develop new skills, but to become smarter and more capable of taking on larger and larger challenges. The larger the challenges get, um, you know, it's not that people will become less capable, but she says that people can become capable because of those challenges. And she says that this kind of research contradicts the growing body of other kinds of research that says that human agency, um, human agency necessarily may not be important. She says that human agency and personal and collective motivation are both linked together. Um, and she says that regenerative business design is always going to be focused on human nature. Whenever it tries to understand people, it will focus on human nature and what the science has said about it. Um, and she often goes against something called behavioral psychology, because she says that behavioral psychology or behaviorism is based on tests that they carried out on non-humans, so on animals. And we've sort of applied these ideas of motivation and external reward to human beings, which doesn't necessarily help them grow and develop. So she essentially says that we need to focus more on developmental ideas. And this is sort of where the psychology of the science comes in for her, and where she contrasts. Now, for her, there are 7 important qualities that a regenerative business, or any business process that calls itself regenerative, needs to focus on. So, if you're not focusing on these qualities, if you don't know what these qualities are, you may not be doing the right thing in terms of regeneration. So, it's sort of like these are the fundamental truths you must understand and kind of ascribe to. So, the first is that wholeness, that we need to understand and recognize that every human being is a whole being. And she says that we have a tendency to see people only in terms of those characteristics or traits that are immediately apparent to us. Each description, she says, that we have of any person is impartial, and none of those descriptions can speak to the whole person. So we need to recognize that and understand this. The second is potential. So potential for her, in this regard, means that it's an overlooked aspect of living beings as a whole. But she says that we need to reconnect to people's potential. It's not that people don't have potential, or we need to insert potential into people, but that we need to reconnect people to their potential. So it's not about what people are, but who they're trying to become, right? Who are people trying to become? So that's an important question to ask when thinking about employees for her. So you see someone at face value where they are right now, but who are they in this endeavor trying to become as well? Then reciprocity. Reciprocity is just entering reciprocal relationships with people is important, she says, and it needs to be seen as important because it helps people build a capacity to understand the other's world, and it leads to people actually being more motivated when they understand other people better. So relationship is paramount. Then authenticity. Authenticity just means recognizing, someone's authentic self, being able to see people as they are as a whole. So who do people think of themselves? What do people say is their authentic self? We need to be able to believe that. Then the concept of nestedness. This is kind of a new word as well, not very commonly used, but it just means that we need to understand the context in which people live, act, so on and so forth, and always kind of look at those actions through that context. Then we think about nodal intervention. So nodal intervention is, again, a very new word, kind of a scary word, but basically businesses need to figure out what kind of intervention will reveal someone's potential. So if someone is a natural storyteller, right, um, how do we probe people in the right way? So if someone's a storyteller, but they don't have the discipline or the training to create the structure to powerfully communicate, right, in a business setting, how can we intervene to make that potential come out in an appropriate way for them? And then finally, we need to believe in the development of capability in people. So We need to give people structured opportunities. So all of this needs to be structured opportunities to build their skills, and we need to give people a certain context. We need to give people a certain context in which they can develop their own capability to self-manage themselves. So what kind of capability do we want in people? The capability to self-manage, and the ability to critically think. So these are sort of the values that a regenerative business needs to have. So this kind of lays down the groundwork that enables people to be authentic, to develop their inner potential, and that allows people to regenerate themselves. So now this sort of idea and understanding of what people need to become or how people should be viewed is important to understand before we move on to chapter 2, which is the evolution of work design. So evolution of work design, hopefully you remember what work design means, but um, work design is kind of key to developing people. So we can talk about developing people all day, but how do you actually do it, right? How do you actually instill those critical thinking skills? How do you actually make sure that people are growing into their potential, right? And we're not just training them. That depends on the ability to have a certain kind of work design. So it is the way usually that work design is the, and we've spoken about it before, but we need to go deeper. So it's the way an organization creates the necessary conditions for its people to accomplish a collective purpose. And in particular, it's a business's functional foundations, the means by which it organizes itself and gets its work done. So how do we organize ourselves, and how do we get work done? What are the necessary conditions that we always make sure we're creating? What is the kind of context we're always trying to create so that we always have a collective purpose? That is what work design means. And work design, this is a bit too theoretical. So ultimately, if you were to translate it into something more concrete, work design addresses how you make decisions. What is the decision-making process in the company? What is the reporting relationship? How do different kinds of individuals report to each other? How is pay managed? How is promotion managed? How do people get hired? How do people get managed? So all of this makes up work design, and one needs to make sure that the kinds of decision making, the kinds of reporting relationships, all of these things, how they're defined, how they're structured, they're always creating the condition that so that people have a collective purpose. So this is what work design is. But for Sanford, a majority of work design, we've already gone through this, but majority of work design is haphazard, and it's quite generic for her, and it's full of various kinds of best practices. And when this is the case, she says that businesses tend to undermine their own success. So she says there is something called bad work design as well, which relegates people to repetitive, uncreative work, and something that is spirit killing, as she phrases it. But the alternative should be something that focuses on the philosophy of human development. And for her, regenerative work design kind of begins from the idea that human beings share certain fundamental characteristics. And these characteristics are that they have an innate desire to grow, that they believe in social benefit, and they derive a sense of meaning from contributing to something greater than themselves. And she says that research on work design is backed by various different subjects and disciplines. So it's an interdisciplinary field of inquiry where you take studies from psychology, you take studies from engineering, you take studies from education. And a lot of the themes that the research on work design focuses on is themes of motivation. How do people get motivated? Worker health, something called change theory, innovation, human development, which is a field in and of itself, and also concepts of productivity. But she says that what's missing right now is that nobody's bringing these diverse streams of thought and research together in any kind of relationship. Either people are just borrowing from psychology or from engineering or from education, or just focusing on motivation or just focusing on productivity, so on and so forth. But she says that a regenerative work design concept always focuses on a coherent worldview where no one discipline can explain work design, and that everything addresses the full dimension of human and business development. So it is never off the shelf, and she says that work design is unique to the particular business it doesn't have to look the same in each regenerative business. So there is also a certain history of work design that is really important to understand that she goes over. We'll be quick about this, but it's really essential in understanding how things have evolved. And interestingly, when you actually go through the history, you realize that, hey, the kind of work design that I have in my business is process improvement, which is not something that actually is backed by research. It's not something that actually helps individuals grow in a business. So we move from this is sort of the timeline, and we move from the first stage to the second to the third. So um, so initially, work design focused on something called process improvement. And process improvement kind of focuses on how well a business and all of its people are performing. So it's all about performance. And so serving customers is important as well. But there's a huge emphasis on numbers and numbers only. So businesses in this kind of work design are seen as machines, and all their aspects, including employees, are seen as mechanical parts. People are slaves to their businesses, to the business, to their roles, and so on. And um, there's a lot of emphasis on rewards and punishments in such businesses. Um, and rewards and punishments are used to create some kind of innovation. So she says that this is an authoritarian system of running a business, where employees are also ranked by peers and supervisors, and there's a belief in such businesses that people are predictive, and that their ability to perform is predetermined by their heritage or their history. And she says that such companies rely very heavily on procedures. They rely very heavily on rigid job descriptions, on written communications, on very hierarchical reporting relationships, and clarity and order. These are prized in such businesses, and success is measured based on performance. So, she says that it has since become apparent that when performance is of primary concern, the scope of work design tends to be very narrow, and it's usually just focused on efficient functioning. Um, and then she sort of goes on to say that, by the 20th century, or you could say the second half of the 20th century, there was a new focus, and the focus was on human growth. And this was largely influenced by something called the human potential movement, which was focused on cognitive psychology and breakthroughs in neuroscience. So, and this enriched the thought of how to provide meaningful work to an empowered workforce. So there was a huge focus on meaningful work here, and there was an emphasis that people need to leave their comfort zones in order to grow. So when you leave your comfort zone, you grow, and we need to throw people into situations that are unfamiliar to them. But in contrast, it's better to ask. According to Sanford, this isn't the approach either, according to her, because here you're forcing people into situations. It's better to ask, why aren't people inviting themselves out of their comfort zones? Why do we have to force them? And so she says that for personal growth, you need that autonomy. And people develop new skills and insights when they're challenged, yes, but not when they're forced. Um, and she does largely ascribe to this concept of human growth. She's not opposed to it entirely, um, but she says that ultimately, there is this idea of human growth 2.0, which is something I coined, but this is sort of where Sanford comes in. So she takes human growth, the human growth aspect a step further, and she says that um, and she quotes various people like Carol Dweck, who was a professor at Stanford as well. And she sort of advocates that business leaders need to stop focusing narrowly on results, and they need to praise people for their courage. That we need to praise people for being courageous enough to move beyond their comfort zones. And she says that this creates judgment-free environments, and there's a huge focus on agency here and autonomy. And she says that the human growth approach, this approach kind of arose out of this overemphasis on efficiency, but it still addresses it still sort of fails to address the development of the capacity to reflect and manage one's own motivation, right? So you're motivated, right? When you're in this scenario, you are motivated to an extent, but you're not you're not self-motivated, you could say, or you're not managing yourself. And so this third stream of human growth also explores theories of complex living systems, so living systems theories. And this approach basically says that human beings, they are self-motivated, but also just the fact that we don't exist in a vacuum, right? That we exist in that we exist in a broad sociological system, and the business is a part of that. And we need to understand that we are a part of something larger than ourselves. And this idea is important because it's possible to motivate people to move out of their comfort zones, because there's so much curiosity in people and there's so many new things to learn, and it's possible for people to self-manage that for themselves. Now, work design and system regeneration is very closely linked. And this is because self-managed development is the source of not only true human development, but it inspires businesses. So what does that mean, right? So let's say that um, we want to regenerate our business processes or systems. So in order to do that, you have to change your work design. So you need to understand that human beings create certain. Why do human beings have systems, right? They create systems to create a pattern, or to manage what would otherwise be a chaotic experience, right? So when we have a system in place, we can examine its effects and we can set about improving it. Now, she sort of extends this and says that the higher source of motivation comes from a longing, and that this is buried in each human being. Every human being has a certain longing to live a meaningful life and to make a significant contribution. So, a meaningful life and to make a significant contribution to the world. And she says that once this is actually awakened, we go beyond self expression or self interest, and we actually move towards something more compelling. It leads us to a lifelong quest to grow in our capabilities and our capacities, to be of service to something. And ultimately, she says that we need to have a work design that addresses this longing that people have. So Human Growth 2.0 is what should be addressing this. So that is the kind of work design we need. Because why do we need it? It's not just because she just doesn't like these other work design theories, but the idea that none of those address the idea that there is a longing in human beings to live a meaningful life, and that they have a lifelong quest to grow, and that they want to make a contribution to the world. So ultimately, system work design helps us have a proper system in place, and we need systems because anything that is hard or chaotic to understand, systems will help simplify. Now, how does she actually build a business case for this? Right? We can talk about these concepts all day long, like I said before, but how does this work on a practical level, right? So she makes this business case where she says that the emerging business environment of the 21st century demands that businesses be nimble, be resilient, and be innovative. And this may have changed since she wrote that book, but most of it stands true. And she says that because the world is like this now, we need intelligent and adaptable workforces. And this is very true in terms of AI as well. So we need intelligent, adaptable workforces that can anticipate evolutions in markets before they even become apparent. So she says that all business leaders talk about the same questions and have the same pressing issues, and all these can be addressed through a regenerative approach to work design. So a regenerative work design, which is a work design that focuses on human growth 2.0, like I said, can help address all of the questions that business leaders have. So questions of, how can I hire top talent, for instance? How can I hire and retain top talent? So a regenerative work design will focus on developing its talent rather than buying it. That's really important because you're going to help build critical thinking and personal capacity in people instead of chasing a limited pool of talent. The second question we often ask is, how can I become the best place to work? And a regenerative work design focused business never thinks in terms of best place to work, because doing so kind of motivates people by self-interest. But instead, one should kind of think about, how can we be the best place for employees to make a contribution to the greater good? So um, rather than HR programs being the main motivator for people, how can we make people feel motivated themselves? So it's not about being the best place to work, but the best place to make a contribution. And then how can I make my company really innovative? And this depends on various things. But again, for Sanford, your culture, your business culture matters a lot, and your workforce capabilities matter a lot. So both of these things are important for innovation, not just capabilities or technical know-how, but the culture that one is a part of, right? The business culture. And she says that every team member should be seen as having to contribute to something innovative. This is not just the work of research and development departments, right? but everybody in a team. It's a for her it's a condition of employment. So it's a condition of employment, and we'll talk about this further. Now, the next question people often ask is, how do we build resilience to weather the market fluctuations that often happen, right? So Sanford says that financial performance comes from the ability to create, to be creative. So she says that whenever there are fluctuations, it's important that businesses become creative, and that kind of gives businesses an edge. And she says that instead of selling more and more of the same product, we should focus on being an industry leader and reliably growing our customer base. And sort of the last question is, how do we deal with ever increasing complexity? It feels like every single day, business management, business, or just organizational stuff, all of that is becoming very complex. And in the age of AI, we can say that much more clearly and easily as well. So she says that when you have a work design focused on human growth and human longing, right, you're able to see through the chaos to the patterns that will allow a certain system to evolve. So there's always patterns, according to her. Whenever there's complexity, there's always certain patterns as well that you can see. And it's important for a business to respond to these opportunities that they see in the patterns, and this can lead to reinvention. So complexity should always lead to reinvention. And so the last thing is, how do I make my business a healthy place to work? Usually ethical employers and people who care about their employees ask these questions. And she says that there's a huge relationship between work design, and the studies have sort of shown that there's a causal relationship in people's well-being. So for her, the idea is that the conditions should be such that people are able to innovate and that other people are able to benefit from the business, and this guarantees that the workforce will remain healthy. So you have to make sure that that larger purpose is there for people. Now, so this is the business case she's making. She's basically saying that, look, my idea of regenerative business can answer all the questions that you've ever had about your business or that most executives have. And it can also go a step further and do something meaningful for people and make sure that we're looking at each other as human beings. Now, what is the blueprint, right? So what is the blueprint for actually creating this work design? So this is where things get a lot more, you could say, verbose, because I think this is where the book kind of lacks as well. There's a lot of new words that come up. So there are various criteria according to Sanford, and there are 3 main criteria to be exact that you need to have in your work design for it to be regenerative and for it to focus on human growth and the human longing to contribute to something greater, so on and so forth, everything that we've addressed, right? So what are the 3 criteria? Now, the 3 criteria have 3 other concepts within them. So 3 core capabilities. So in order to have this criteria, you need to develop these capabilities in your workforce. So you'll see this is the first criteria, this is the second criteria, and this is the third criteria. And we'll go through each one step by step. So this is just to kind of make sure that you don't get shocked or scared, because these are new words and they're not very common in business jargon. So the first criteria is called internal locus of control. What does that mean? That means that the degree to which one is able to take full responsibility for one's actions. People should be able to take full responsibility for what they're doing and the outcomes that they're producing for themselves and others. And this is correlated to a happy and healthy, productive life. So to develop this main, you could say, criteria, you need 3 core capabilities in yourself and in others. These 3 criteria are, so first is non-attached integrity. What is non-attached integrity? Non-integrity relies on clarity. So to have non-attached integrity, you need to have clarity about what you believe to be true or you believe to be good. Non-attachment just means that you have to be open to the possibility that your beliefs can evolve as a result of self-examination and engagement. So usually, so this is what it means. This is what non-attached integrity means. Then reflective self-accountability. This is just the idea that when people are able to personally hold themselves responsible by doing what they say they will do in order to produce what they say they will produce, there's a practice of noticing. when they've fallen short. So they'll notice when they've fallen short, they'll notice when they're delivering on a promise or when they're not. And so it's sort of placing control in our own hands. So the reflection comes from being able to notice, right? When you're doing something right, when you're actually contributing or actually producing the work you're saying you'll do. And self accountability is just being in control, placing the control in our own hands. So sometimes, the kind of feedback that is given can place attention on what others think and not on what people think about their own capacity and reflection. So that's why feedback isn't always the best way to hold anyone accountable. And inner aims. Inner aims are just the idea that people's ability to remember that people know what inspires them and motivates them, and um, we need to make conscious effort that people remember what inspires and motivates them. And this is different from affirmations, right, which are directed towards getting more of what one wants out of life. So this isn't reciting affirmations every day, but just remembering, what is it that inspires me to do this work? What is it that inspires me to come to work every day or motivates me? So all of that needs to align. And all of that ultimately helps one meet the criteria of internal locus of control. Then we come to the second one, external considering. So this again has three other capabilities attached to it. So external considering is just the ability to take into account and care deeply about the effect of one's actions on other beings. So are you considering what your actions will do externally to others? And it means caring deeply about something or someone in addition to ourselves. So it counters the human tendency to be narrowly self-referential. So the first one is the will to create, right? Um, and the will to create is just sort of you could say, an engaged kind of caring. Um, yeah, so the will to create is one of the fundamental beliefs that people come most alive and feel the greatest meaning in their lives when they see how their actions create benefit for something beyond themselves. So this is people's source, right? What is your source to will to create? When you can see that what you're doing is going to create meaning in your lives, and how that their actions will create benefit for something. There needs to be a will to create in people, and that's usually the source. Then we have engaged caring. So engaged caring is the idea that it refers to an active commitment to increase the capacity of others to fulfill their own purposes and potential. So you're making sure that you're helping your colleagues reach their own capacities, and you're being collaborative in a way that you're helping others fulfill their purpose and potential. And there's a lot of compassion involved here. And she says that true caring requires compassion, generosity, and selflessness, and it also involves sort of a restraining. You need to restrain your self-centered tendencies to provide people with answers, or to tell people that you can do their work better, or giving people unsolicited advice, right? Um, so this kind of caring also helps us manage our egos at work, according to Sanford. And then we have core discernment. Core discernment is the act of engaging in, you could say, it's seeing through current conditions to the enduring cores and underlying patterns of living beings. Now, that's a big statement. What does that mean? So, it's just the idea that we need to understand that um, we need to discern, right? In our life, we need to discern many times, and we need to understand that there's a certain context in which things happen. So, there's an example that, when children are going through puberty, for instance. So, when children are going through puberty, they're trying a variety of strategies to fit in their social environment. They experiment, so on and so forth. But this these behaviors are all about fitting in. So these behaviors don't mean that that is what the child is. That the child is someone who just wants to fit in, right? You should be able to discern between the core of who someone is and the behaviors that they're displaying at the current moment. So being able to differentiate between these two is core discernment. So it's all about thinking about other people, this criteria. And then the third one is personal agency. Personal agency again has three different capabilities, right? The first one is promises beyond ableness. What does this mean? This just means that personal agency is ignited when people rise up to challenges beyond what they imagine is possible. That you are going to take on a challenge, uh, even though you don't know if you're able to do it, right? But you're going to do it. You're going to imagine that it's possible. So um, that you will sort of muster up the will to work on something that is beyond what you usually do. And this requires a high level of what you call self-efficacy. So this is why it's important for businesses to build on capabilities that people may not necessarily have, but people can evolve, right? So if you want personal agency, you should make promises in the business, take up certain challenges that you can't promise, it may be beyond what you've ever done, but taking up such challenges can lead to personal agency. Then we have self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is fundamental to personal agency because the idea self-efficacy is just the trust that we have in ourselves that we can figure out something regardless of how unfamiliar or difficult it is. We can figure it out no matter what, right? And this comes to people when they understand themselves and they understand the processes that they can use to take on new challenges. What are the tools that are available to them? And this is a really good antidote, she says, to fear of failure in a business, in employees or just as a whole, which is found in most organizational cultures. Then we have nodal realization. So we had nodal intervention before. I don't know why she uses the word nodal a lot, but nodal realization. Now, she kind of says that, look, a node is a point in a system. So let's say this is the system. A node is just a point in a system where a relatively small intervention can have a big effect. So you make a small intervention and it will have a huge effect as a result. So she says that realization refers to the ability to envision sort of the dynamics occurring in any system and the effects that will ripple out from a particular intervention when you make. So um, it's just the idea that, okay, what are the nodes in my business that if I were to intervene could create a huge effect, right? um, an understanding of, okay, where do these nodes reside in the system and how can we actually take action to 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 have a big effect. So personal agency in a business also means recognizing these nodes. And she says that these nodes are rarely visible. They have to be discovered by understanding or imagining how a system could potentially work, right? So there's a lot of imagination involved when it comes to the idea of personal agency. So all of these three criteria need to be met in order for one to have a work design that is regenerative. And we need to build these things in our people. And she says that these three criteria are all interlinked, they're linked together. Um, and she says that there's a necessary connection between these three. And she says that there needs to be an interaction between all three criteria for there to be a real impact. Um, and she says that accomplishing this is a steep learning curve, but she says that we have to promise beyond ableness. So that's something that she says. And she also says that disruption is that if we commit to these three, we can see disruption in our organization increasing. And she says that when one of these criteria drops out, the result is usually sort of a shortfall in vision or execution. So there's usually a shortfall in vision and execution. We can go back up if we have all the three criteria again. So she says, for instance, if a person has a high level of locus of control and personal agency and no external considering for other people, people can become greedy in a business. So she says these three only work when they're working together. Otherwise, they may not work. Now, how do we actually design work, right? This is again a very important consideration. So most organizations know that if they want to have a kind of disruptive innovation that we talked about in part one, they will have to create, or not really create, but they will need creative people in their team. And they also need to understand that they must, alongside these creative people, provide certain conditions within which such people will flourish. So, in addition to sort of the culture that one has in their organization, they must design work in a way that invites innovation, right? So, work has to be designed a certain way, and you need certain conditions for that. So, just as we've seen that for a certain kind of regenerative business, what are the different criterias? And we've looked at those criteria specifically in terms of people, right? When we've looked at personal agency, when we've looked at external considering, right? All of this is related to people. But there are certain criteria that also relate to work that have to be met within a regenerative business. So we're going to go through those particular criteria in this section. So, um, most of all, this is to ensure that people continue to grow creatively, that they're hired, they're creative, but that creativity doesn't become stagnant. It needs to grow in some direction, and it needs to flourish, and it needs to be supported. So this it also expands what people themselves think can be possible, what they can do with their own creativity. And so people go on various kinds of transformational endeavors, she says, through such conditions. So there are various kinds of design criteria you need. And so overall, you can have an innovation culture, or you may want an innovative culture, but you can't really have that unless you have the three design criteria. The three design criteria are sort of titled change accelerator, initiative activation, and development infrastructure. And these fundamental conditions are, I could say these criteria are also called conditions when we talk about work design. And when they're present in an organization, people are able to develop the capabilities that we talked about earlier. So you can't really have or easily develop things like personal agency and external considering and internal locus of control without these conditions. So everything is interconnected here. Um, so overall, the first criteria is initiative activation, and um, mostly it is intended to foster the ability of every member in an organization to take initiative. So everyone should be able to take initiative with regard to building the business. So with regard to building a world-changing business. So everyone should feel like they can think like a CEO, that they can give their opinions, and there isn't any kind of hierarchy in terms of this. So usually this is a structured means for, so this is, you could say it's a structured way of ensuring that the tendency people have for personal agency is able to flourish, that people actually are are able to um, embrace that personal agency and use it and bring it into the business. So you need this structure. This is what will allow that agency to come out. This will draw that inherent human tendency out. And Sanford says that a lot of businesses um, they spend time on delegating tasks to people, and it's usually people who are higher up in your hierarchy. And this allows people to, or sort of trains people to be pattern followers. So pattern followers, which means that they generate patterns, and this limits what innovation can become and what innovation can be. And so you need to be creative, and being creative is fundamental to who we are as human beings, according to Sanford. And she says that organizations have an obligation, a sacred obligation, in her opinion, to foster that. So there are various kinds of elements within this as well, right? So all of these particular factors will create this one condition. And the first one of these is structured work progression. It's following the previous format, right, of the other criterion we've seen. Um, so usually in the corporate world, or in any kind of business, usually, or big companies, you have to kind of there's usually a ladder that you need to climb, right, as an employee. And a regenerative business instead provides a path, okay, more like a path. It's not something that's going upwards, but it's just sort of steadily taking you along. And this path is sort of the path of structured work progression. And so this requires a set of transparent agreements. These can be sort of formulated in whatever way the business sees as appropriate, but there should be agreements with regards to what constitutes appropriate work and how it needs to be carried out. So what is appropriate work, plus how should it be carried out? So when these things are in place, right, When these particular things are in place, all employees are able to sort of self-assess whether the work that they're doing justifies the use of certain resources and supports the overall intentions of the business. So creative people usually need something to push against. And in regenerative business, that comes from a well conceived, articulated corporate direction. So you need direction. When you have direction, creative people know that, okay, the foundation is there. We can sort of push against that sometimes to be creative. So creativity doesn't mean that you don't have a direction in your company. And Sanford says that you need to also have a deep understanding of the the groups, the clientele that this creativity is being directed towards as well. So usually the business and the people need to acknowledge and develop this creativity over time. And this also involves taking up various kinds of complex initiatives and challenges. So transparent agreements need to be there for structured work progression. But structured work progression does not mean that you're just constantly climbing up a corporate ladder. You're following a certain path that allows for you to be creative. Because structure allows for a certain pushback that people are not afraid to make, right? Because they know, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And this creativity is within the scope of the work I've been assigned, and I can use certain resources for that. So then we have buyer focused field teams. Now, so according to Stanford, you need to really understand your buyers and you need to understand them on a deep level. And this is kind of fundamental to um, the kinds of initiatives that regenerative business take on, right? They bring the buyer groups to life. So these aren't just numbers, right? In a regenerative business, you need to engage your employees to understand these people, to understand their lives, and this is sort of done by buyer focused field teams. So each of these teams focuses on one key group that is served by the organization. So what happens is that you have this field team, for instance, and every member of the organization sits on one of these teams. Okay, so you have team one, you have team two, three, four, five, and every member of the organization sits on one of these teams, which engages in research, and there's deep reflection about the lives and purposes of their chosen buyer group. So there's a lot of reflection happening here, and there's research happening here. And how they would anticipate is the best way to serve these buyers. Now, each field team also educates and advocates on behalf of these buyers to the rest of the organization. So it also advocates for the buyers. So you're making sure that you're not cheating them or you're not doing something that is unfair. So conventional businesses, according to Stanford, usually delegate thinking about buyers to the marketing and sales team, right? Usually the equivalent of this could be marketing and sales. So what's so different about this? Why not call it just that? And this sort of leaves everyone else to kind of focus narrowly on procedures and standards to carry out their tasks. But in regenerative business, all workers have to spend some portion of their time in the week thinking directly about the effect that their work will have on real people in the world. So some small amount of time each week is needed to think about the buyers, to think about why are they doing this work and what effect will it have on real people. Because these teams are sort of drawn across the organization and they're different people, this will allow for what, according to Stanford, is a cross pollination of information, and there will be less gaps, and they'll be able to discover different kinds of buyer groups, and so this leads to a certain kind of intelligence. And like we learned before, regenerative businesses call themselves intelligent businesses and intelligent organizations. So much of that comes from buyer focused field teams. So having these is a really good idea in a business if you want to really focus on who buyers are as people and to ultimately humanize them for your workers. Then we have responsible financial measures. Now, one reason, sort of according to Sanford, companies hold tightly to, you could say, hierarchical structures is, forgive me, I only know how to make stickmen, but bear with me here. But you need, so there are hierarchical structures when it comes to decision making in companies. And every decision usually has financial implications, right? And knowledge and understanding of the company's finances is usually very closely guarded by certain individuals who are high up in the pyramid. And so is the decision making then, right? So if all the information about finances is up here, then the decision making, the major decision making happens up here as well. But in contrast, in a regenerative business, initiatives are launched at all levels of the organization. And so it becomes critical that every member has a clear grasp of finances and their relationship to overall strategic and sort of what do the finances have, what are the implications of the finances, right, in terms of ethics and strategy. So each person understands that. And this includes, workers are sort of have to understand or are expected to understand things like cash flow. They should be able to understand things like earnings and margins, and sort of how decisions can affect these kinds of measures. So if you make a decision, how will it affect all of these areas in the business? Every worker should know that. And if there's a new initiative, it should be planned in a way that takes fully into account that there need to be responsible financial measures in place. So this is a key part of this, and how these areas will sort of positively affect, society and the environment. And so every member is expected to have this capability. And this is part of what Sanford calls people being able to think like CEOs. So these are sort of the three main factors in initiative activation, which is essential for a regenerative work design, which again is essential for helping people develop the various kinds of capacities like personal agency, which are necessary for regenerative business. So the next part that we come to is developmental infrastructure. So are people being trained to produce only generic results? That's the question that comes up. What are people being trained for? How are we actually developing our people? So we need to understand that businesses can create a developmental infrastructure that enables the evolution, or sort of the helps embed a regenerative culture by setting up a pattern of various processes that supports individual and collective development of the workers. So usually, yes, it is a set of recurring processes. So a lot of organizations, like we've discussed before, they try to achieve this through training, or goal setting, various kinds of assessments, surveys, performance reviews, objectives. But usually these programs are treating employees very generically, like they're interchangeable. And sort of the key to working developmentally is to understand that all employees of the organization are unique, right? So they're unique humans. And the key to working um, with these unique humans is to understand that they have creative energies that are to be unleashed, that needs to be nurtured. And businesses must ensure that this uniqueness that each person has is being drawn out, realized, and sort of amplified in some way. And so um, overall, the business has to have a certain kind of consideration for the people it's working for and understand them uniquely as uniquely as they can. And there are three factors that sort of allow a business to create this kind of infrastructure. Infrastructures are not necessarily bad, just as long as people are able to build the capacity that they need um, to produce innovative outcomes. Infrastructure doesn't work well, according to Sanford, when people are just being trained and mentored to produce generic results. So that's sort of part of what she's saying. So there are three factors that we need to consider in a developmental infrastructure. So the first is, or what needs to be included, is regular development events, self-directed work plans, and resource roles. So let's just start with regular developmental roles. Regular developmental events. Forgive me for that. So usually, according to Sanford, learning and change, so these are the two keywords here, occur most effectively through a recurring regular developmental event. So this needs to be recurring, and it needs to be kind of like a regular event that happens. And this includes in-depth courses in personal and professional development, rather than, you could say, one-time concentrated interventions. So you can have one-time trainings and you can have retreats, according to her, but she says in-depth learning is really important. And she says that people need time to test and evolve and sort of merge the new ideas that they're learning into their work so they can use these ideas effectively. And she says that when you learn something, there should be an active process of testing this, right? And refining it. And so through this, they actually are actively engaging with the idea that they're learning. And the next and the next. And so they're able to manage their own idea generation through this, and sort of direct new thoughts within the business. And this kind of training, she says, requires time, and it unfolds through time and requires various kinds of learners to be aware of the changes that are occurring in their own practice, in their own work. So what kind of changes are occurring? So some kind of reflection on that is important. And um, usually she says that anybody can generate new ideas, and this isn't just that highly educated members of the management can only do that, that you need to be in upper level management to do that. And she says that to have these kinds of events for all employees allows the company or the business to become really flexible. You become really flexible thinkers, you become intelligent overall, and you become really comprehensive. And so all of these qualities help you anticipate and prepare for anything that is unexpected, or for you to be disruptive in the market itself, to bring in a new idea into the industry. So she kind of emphasizes all of these various qualities when it comes to learning. Then she focuses a lot on self directed work plans. So this kind of speaks for itself that usually in a regenerative business, individuals should have their own self directed work plans, and they should create their own self directed plans for their own development. So they should design certain, you could say, learning journeys for themselves that address the kinds of effects, you could say, the kinds of outcomes they want to see in their work. And this will help strengthen the company and will lead to a certain kind of personal development. So yes, the employees are learning for the company, so the company grows, but also their own personal development, which is just a byproduct, right? And she says that typically companies, that are more like a top-down approach, um, work plans are usually dictated by supervisors based on what's being said in the hierarchy. And this is both self-directed, but according to her, it's also very collegial. And she says that when we talk about self-directed plans, the workers organize their development based on the promises beyond ableness they make. So when you have a self-directed work plan, you're saying, okay, this is my current ability, right? But I want to move beyond that, and I want to move beyond the ability that I have. So usually the employee themselves has a good idea of where their ability is and what capacity they'd be able to go beyond that. And she says that this kind of authority and responsibility in sort of putting that directly in the hands of employees allows them to understand their own goals, to identify their goals, and bring something meaningful to them, and have goals that are not just ones that are expected of them, but the ones that they actually care about. And there's a high chance of them sticking to these goals then as well. So workers can make their own promises in their way, and this can improve productivity. So these are sort of the main aims that she's talking about. And she says that there's usually no communication problems when you have these kinds of work plans, because there's no need for instruction, there's no need for a supervisor, all of that is eliminated. And so when work is self-initiated, workers take on their own responsibility for getting information, and internal politics also decrease. And so there's no need for gossip or anything else where there could be certain hierarchies or certain kinds of oppressive systems in place. So you sort of see that this is a bit different from regular development events, right? So these usually can come from external areas, but self-directed work plans kind of can inform what kind of developmental events need to be happening. So there needs to be sort of a balance between self-directed work and also work that is a bit more structured and external. Then we come to resource roles. So resource roles, um, so if we think about a business from Sanford's perspective, um, supervisors are not very popular for Sanford, or you could say supervisors aren't something that are very popular in regenerative businesses, because um, there needs to be something beyond giving instructions. So resource roles, or you could say there needs to be a developmental resource in the company, a functional resource, and people in the company who have a high degree of knowledge and skill and experience in a particular field. So that could be engineering, it could be marketing, it could be law, it could be um, any particular subject, right? They can make those capabilities available to others. So people are making certain promises, right, through their own self-directed work. But someone who is a knowledge expert, you could say, right, in a particular field, has a high degree of knowledge, can help people meet those promises by sharing that knowledge and making that capability available. So people who are in resource roles make their own promises to figure out how they can help individuals and teams that they are called on to support. So this is a support role. Again, there is no hierarchical instructional supervisor here. And she says that there should be a specialized group of such resources. Um, and this can help people grow their strategic thinking, their self management, so on and so forth. Um, and so this leads to a place where people are not just um, so the resource is actually helping people focus um, on their own promises and their own goals, and this allows for employees to successfully sort of move into innovative territory, because there is a human support here. So you're not just learning information, but you have a human level of connection with the other person who is sharing their knowledge with you. And you don't have to test it out as much as you would with a regular development event, right? Someone is already telling you what kind of capability you will need and what works and what doesn't. So resource calling it a resource role helps a lot, because people who are knowledge experts, they are a resource for the company, and they should be available to different teams, and different teams and people should be able to approach them. Now we move on to the change accelerator. The change accelerator is the third criteria. So Sanford says that a lot of businesses only work on internal changes that have to do with how the business operates. They sort of try to direct people's attention, through incentives and who's going to receive what reward, for adopting what kind of behavior, and certain people become role models for the rest. But she says that unfortunately, this kind of program is imposed on people, and it destroys motivation, it destroys innovation, and it also takes away personal agency. And it's really not good for helping people manage themselves and manage their own responsibilities. And so she says what's needed instead is a change accelerator, which is an approach to change that connects people's motivations to meaningful effects that they could have in the world. So, how do we bring about an internal change in the company? If we want to change things, how do we do that? Right? How do we produce beneficial change in the world, um, rather than making sure that people are working towards rewards and incentives, and being a role model in the company? How can we direct people's attention to actually thinking about changing the world or changing the industry? So that is what the change accelerator does. It's just an approach to change. Think of it that way. It's just an approach. And people don't usually dislike change, according to Sanford. And it's not that people don't want to change, it's that they usually don't see a compelling reason to change. And businesses, that don't have very strong aims for themselves, they won't have that acceleration. But a business that wants to kind of, she says, set the world on fire, will set its people on fire as well. So that's a big word, right? Setting the world on fire. Businesses who think like this will sort of initiate change. So she says that a business that sort of wants to do this usually will address three main things. So generative parameters, significance evaluation, and evolutionary stages. So we can start with evolutionary stages. So we can start with, yeah, let's go start with his. So usually, Sanford says that, and that a regenerative organization pursues evolutionary strategies on behalf of whole systems. So a simpler way to put it is that regenerative businesses focus on customers, communities, and ecosystems, as well as suppliers, and all the living entities that will engage in all of this, or the business will engage with. So rather than focusing on what the current conditions are, a regenerative business will work to enable all these communities, right, to to also realize the potential that they have, um, or the potential that they have to become what they want to become. So it's not just a regenerative business doesn't only serve to sort of develop its own employees, but it also is a strategist and a research and you could say an R&D partner for its stakeholders. So usually businesses, they can be a bit self-serving and focused on how to gain a competitive advantage um, with the position that they hold or they're trying to achieve in the industry. So customers often feel ignored by the companies that they're dependent on. And so Sanford says that if you want to be a disruptor in the industry, you need to see the systems and the people that you're serving in terms of their evolutionary potential. So evolutionary potential is really important. And she says that this is the only way you can introduce ideas that go beyond what anyone else is thinking while also being in harmony with the aspirations of customers and other stakeholders. So you should be able to see that. And it should always be meeting stakeholders, not just where they are, but where they could possibly go. So that's usually what evolutionary strategies means, that any kind of strategizing that you're doing as a business shouldn't make a company feel ignored, right? Your strategies in your business shouldn't be simply self-serving, and usually they are usually self-serving, or even self-serving to any extent, right? If you're strategizing, you should make sure that the outcome will allow other stakeholders, customers, communities to realize their potential, um, or help them understand that what they have the potential to become. So it will allow people to, in a way, manifest that for themselves, or help people understand that yes, they can do something. So strategizing should always make sure that the external people on the outside are being served by it as well, not just the company. So when companies say they're strategists, they should be strategists for their stakeholders primarily. Then we come to significance evaluation. So as these kind of strategies are developed, Sanford says that an organization that aims to disrupt the industry will make sure that these strategies are being tested rigorously. So usually she gives an example of Google, right? That Google is usually famous for pushing its engineers to ask themselves, how can the idea that we have be refined so that it can have a benefit for our stakeholders? Can the benefit that we're trying to produce be amplified? How can we redesign our approach? And so this kind of significance evaluation, what significance can our work have, um, can become something that can lead to breakthroughs. And usually when you're continuously rigorously upgrading ideas through this evaluation, right, you're rethinking things, you're thinking closely about what something means for stakeholders. This naturally leads to certain kinds of thinking capabilities within the organization, that everyone is involved in such capabilities. And usually companies test the significance of a particular idea, um, through various departments. So financial analysts can assess whether something works financially. Operations people can test whether it fits with the supply chain. So this is the norm. And she says that this is a very fragmented approach, and this doesn't allow an organization to think holistically. So usually this is the starting point for any kind of evaluation or assessment. Um, it's sort of the effect that it will create in the market. And so if we're just talking about the effect it will create in the market, right? Not just the effect something will have financially or the effect it will have on the supply chain. This will require a shared assessment, which allows people from all across the company to integrate their perspectives. So when you're doing a significance evaluation, always think about the market as a whole, not just isolate parts of it to specific kinds of you could say experts. And then we come to generative parameters. So like individuals, organizations also define certain promises for themselves. And this is sort of one purpose of strategic planning. So, as we were talking, generative parameters are essentially just allowing you to understand what is the collective promise that's being made, and what are the strategic arenas within which this promise needs to be pursued. So it ultimately just provides a direction for one's pursuit. Now, if we come, so if all of this needs to come in, we've gone through so many different criterias, various different kinds of uh, factors around those criterias. But if all of this needs to come into the business, what actually needs to go? Because surely you need to be making room, right? If something comes in, something else needs to go out, right? Because a business has a limited amount of time, it has a limited amount of means. So you need to ultimately make some space so that something new can come inside. So that is where the next chapter comes in, which is Sanford's identification of toxic business traits that need to go. And we start off with the first one, which is, and we'll also kind of go over the aristocracy paradigm, which is really important before we begin looking at the various toxic practices. But she ultimately says that the oldest unconscious belief influencing business practice is the idea that some small segment of the population is superior to the rest and should be entrusted with decision making on behalf of everybody. So it is a sort of pyramid, you could say, where business practice, this is the business and it's making the decisions for everybody else. And it's making those decisions for a smaller segment. And personal will is replaced by or subordinated to the will of a leader. And, she says this idea comes from traditions relating to kings and ownership of land and other resources that we've seen passed down over what she says the past 6,000 years. And she says that how we define something as superior has changed over millennium. So at times, people have privileged different things, wealth, inheritance, popular acclaim. And she says this paradigm is still very much alive in modern institutions and where the CEO is assumed to be inherently superior and is treated accordingly. And in work design, she says, this really shows up because it can affect business practice. And she says that in the business world, control over ownership results in bureaucracy. So control over ownership results in a bureaucratization. And she says that hierarchies refer to structured sets of relationships that rank people or things in levels one above another. And she says that, at times hierarchies can actually be useful because they help you make sense of complexity and they can help us conceptualize different orders of relationship. So living organisms, are classified into species, and this includes different cells and bacteria and families, just to indicate how closely related they are. But she says the problem arises when we habitually use hierarchies not as a way to organize our thinking, but as a way to organize people to do different levels of thinking. So when you organize people, right, someone's at the top, someone's at the bottom, someone's in the middle, you're not just putting them at different levels of the organization. There's a different level of thinking. So someone at this point might feel like, hey, you know what? There's a certain kind of thinking I'm not allowed to do, or I'm not allowed to contribute in a certain way. And she says this has led to hierarchical organizations where ranking leads to defined levels of authority, responsibility, and power. And she says that in hierarchical businesses, only small groups are allowed to do creative thinking and decision making on behalf of all others. And she says that this is a direct violation. She says this is a direct violation of the principles of personal agency and the internal locus of control that we've seen. And this will undermine, as a whole, over time, intrinsic motivation, and it will undermine accountability. She says even delegation, that flows from the top to the bottom, can be inherently fragmenting because it bounds off tasks to be handed down to subordinates who may never have access to the larger picture, who may never understand the rationale or the meaning for those tasks. So she says that what we need to do instead is, so anyway, this is sort of one of the things that she talks about. And we'll get into delegation in the next slide. But yeah, so ultimately she says that delegation also flows from a hierarchy, and usually if you're delegating very skillfully, right, this is seen as an indication of executive accomplishment. So good delegation is seen as a positive sign. But she says again, like we said, that this can lead to fragments in the business, and it can lead to loss of meaning. And it also means that the decision about which task is important or necessary is being made by the superior. And so this doesn't allow people to become free creative agents. So there's less freedom and there's less creativity. So delegation needs to go if one wants to bring in all of the other criteria for a regenerative business. And management by objective. So she says management by objective is the idea that requires people at the lower levels of the hierarchy um, sort of to define what they will accomplish within the goals that are set by those at the higher levels. So a goal has been set at the higher level, and she says that within this goal, those at the lower level have to find what they need to accomplish. So the goals are already set; they don't get to decide those. And she says that this um, is intended to, not let people think that they're subordinate, because it helps them have some feeling of decision making and autonomy. But she says that there's like boundaries within which the individuals can act, and these boundaries are dictated by those from the top. So um, their actions are, are all their actions are just going back to the top to meet the goals of those who are at the top. So that's what she's saying, that again, this is not something that allows people to be creative or take on their own personal agency. So this also needs to go. Then we have downsizing. She says that in a hierarchy, um, this is taken up by top management to what they call preserving the core of an organization so that it can live on to fight another day, for instance. And she says that this decision flows down through the hierarchy and it can have like devastating impacts on not just employees but on their families, on their communities. And she says that it, it means that there is a systemic effect of downsizing that is not accounted for. And she says that businesses are ultimately harming themselves as well um, because they whenever a market cycle becomes unexpected, right, or unpredictable, businesses are basically telling themselves that we can't prepare for this adequately, so we have to downsize. So businesses forego thinking creatively or trying to build sort of an agreement of how they'll manage the uncertainty by just removing the employees. So this isn't helpful either. Then we have job descriptions. So usually job descriptions communicate what kind of role the individual will fill within these organizations and within what boundaries will they use their creativity. And she says that, yeah, JDs help organizations understand who needs to be assigned what kind of work, right? And there's less confusion and there's less conflict. And she says there's the expectation is set. And she says that in a hierarchy, and you'll notice all of these toxic business practices are based on a hierarchical organization. So in a hierarchy, JDs are determined by the organization, and the expectation is that the employees will adapt themselves to what's been defined. And she says that JDs can be corrosive to personal agency, to innovation and initiative. And she says that they're based on fixed ideas and that the tasks are they fail to take into account that human beings have this ability to observe a changing world around them and that they can learn to produce certain skills and figure out how to do things that they don't know how to do. And so your intrinsic motivation goes down. So A company may as well have JDs, but if they're not fixed ideas, if they're flexible, then that's fine. So it's not so much about the terminology, but what the JD is trying to do. So those kinds of job descriptions need to go as well. So these are the toxic business practices that come under the aristocracy paradigm. Then we have the machine paradigm. The machine paradigm is all about routinization. So she said that since the Industrial Revolution, so we have to go all the way back, since the Industrial Revolution, basically there's been a place in the world for machines, and there's been organized military and social systems that have started operating like machines. And people have been functioning as interchangeable parts in machine like systems. And that this dehumanizes people. And dehumanization is linked to just, is very closely linked to um, something that is, being generic and so on. So she says that this paradigm is very much still alive, and many modern businesses have it, and it's sort of what they say helps them standardize. And because, machines depend on identical parts, inputs, outputs, and this leads to ideals like benchmarks against which people are judged, and there needs to be something identical that needs to be produced. And she says that this leads to a kind of uniformity. And she says that people are just seen as skill sets, or tasks are seen as just problems to be solved, and the organization is just a means by which people are being managed, and you're just trying to achieve certain results. And she says this machine paradigm has been around for so long that people have started to see it as a business reality rather than a business choice. And she says that there are various kinds of uh, other traits that come under this paradigm. So the first is core competencies, um, that these are just some capabilities without which the organization can't function. And these are impersonal to the people who are sort of being designated them, and that this is antithetical to innovation. And these competencies are unchanging, which is a contrast to capacity that we looked at earlier. Then we look at recruitment, right? Recruitment is an extension of the idea that that people have core competencies, and um, companies search and hire based on competencies. So you're hiring competence, you're not really hiring people. And this makes businesses misunderstand the assets that they have and the people that they hire. And she says that um, time and time again, that talent and innovation in the business needs to grow in-house. This is something you need to grow in people. And a lot of businesses think that talent must be hired because you can't grow talent, because growing talent is too expensive. But she says that in her experience, that's completely untrue. That she says that when you can get workers to be connected to their aspirations, they want to learn, and they go beyond that ceiling. Then we come to feedback. She says that, again, feedback is a metaphor that's derived from machines themselves, and it was introduced in common language by thinkers of artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. And she says that it's a way in which machines were governed, and when and it's just to understand whether the machine will shut down or come back up. And she says that feedback can be useful in mechanical systems, but it's not good with human beings, because when you give people information that shuts them down, it's a bad idea, right? So she says that if you're saying that somebody is inadequate, for instance, at their work, then you're projecting a kind of you're sort of projecting something that has to do with you, for instance, that it can undermine integrity and the potential for growth in the one who's also doing the critiquing. And that feedback can also undermine self-management and motivation in employees. So there needs to be a culture of self-reflection and self-correcting. So this is what she said. And she says that feedback also leads to the tendency for people to kind of share unpopular perspectives in the organizations, because they might be worried that they might, if they're not conforming, then they'll get bad feedback. And so she says that it's better to have self-reflection and have sessions where you're allowing your employees to self-reflect on their own work and pushing them to come to certain kinds of conclusions. So feedback can be very harsh and unhelpful. And so she says problem solving is also something that needs to go because um, usually by definition it's focused on addressing what exists and attempting to make it better. But like we looked at before as well, this is not the same as innovation. Innovation means that going beyond what already exists. So we need to move beyond this. She also doesn't like the idea of brainstorming because she says that brainstorming was something that was developed to address one of the shortcomings of problem solving, because problem solving is based on existence and relies on evidence. But brainstorming was intended to break down all of this and put ideas on the table, and she says usually bad ideas. And she says that undisciplined thinking is something that brainstorming promotes, and this leads to undisciplined ideas. And long lists are formed, long documents are made, which are not really helpful. And she says that there's no scientific evidence that brainstorming actually works. It's just something that's been adopted. And she says that instead we should have creativity. Creativity requires a certain discipline of one's cognition. And you have to hold your mind in two contradictory sort of positions where you're trying to go beyond what you're thinking, but you also know what you're trying to achieve in a way. Then she says standards and procedures also need to go because um, precise descriptions of what people need to do can be limiting for them and translates people into cogs, leads to a reduction in creativity. Then binary evaluation is also something that she says is like formulaic, and you're trying to understand whether actions and investments are achieving their purpose, right? But she says that this kind of evaluation is black and white. So what do customers like or dislike, right? So this is strictly binary. Binary evaluation replaces the complexity of reality, and it oversimplifies choices. So that's not something that is very helpful according to her. And she says that binary evaluation is helpful when you're looking at machines because machines are more simple, but humans can assess the value of their actions and choices, right? And so this can undermine motivation as well. Then metrics-based auditing enables companies to account for the results of each of their actions, whether they're meeting the standards that they need to meet. But she says that evaluating is focused on whether actions have achieved their purpose, right? And we have numerical benchmarks, but she says that metrics can be double-edged and they need to be used with care. So she says that it can have a debilitating effect. And she says that you may not always get the expected quantifiable output, and this can limit creativity. So we need to be really careful with metrics. And then we have function teams. So function teams are usually teams that elaborate this mechanical approach to work design, making it more flexible and intelligent. But function teams have a more comprehensive view of work. And she says that such teams, respond to special needs or projects. But she says that the problem is that these kinds of teams perpetuate a fragmented outlook, um, which is characteristic of the machine paradigm. So they focus on streamlining the workings of an organization rather than on discovering what will be required to improve the lives of customers. And this can limit the growth of organization as a whole. So functional teams, that have special needs, they can be very narrow in their approach and narrow in their perspective of who is being served. So better not to have them. And then restructuring refers to changing the way reporting relationships are organized. So for most organizations, restructuring is the preferred method for addressing issues. But she says that most companies don't realize that changes in structure, no matter how big, will not change the thinking processes of workers. So you can change how your company looks, right? Or you can change the position that people are taking up, but that won't change the thinking processes. So when you change the way an organization thinks, then you'll actually achieve a sort of shifting in the nature of the working process. Then we have the behavioral paradigm, and she says that this is all focused on external motivation. So, things like incentives and rewards that we've also looked at previously. And again, she says that in the early 20th century, there was a psychologist at Johns Hopkins who basically founded the discipline of behaviorism. And he was trying to show that behaviors could be objectively observed, categorized in conditions, and There's a very famous behaviorist known as B.F. Skinner who did the dog experiment, and mostly behavioral psychology, like we looked at before, too, is based on primates and other mammals. And he says that behavioral psychology can have far more negative than positive effects. So the first factor in this is usually incentive. So incentive is just like a future reward. So it leads to a single-minded approach to work, which isn't really helpful, and it doesn't stimulate the brain in the right way, and it can lead to self self obsession. It can lead to selfishness that is not good. Then we come to rewards. Rewards are usually built to have like bonds of loyalty between the workers and the superiors. Um, Usually, rewards satisfy a desire and produce a bond with the organization, and it's a much deeper way of building a connection. But the irony is that giving rewards, simply doesn't work in improving performance. So if that's what the company is trying to do, it's actually not doing that. And Daniel Pink in his book Drive also talks about this, that research has shown that rewards are only effective when it comes to simple and menial tasks. Anything that is complex requires a sustained effort, an intrinsic drive, and not external rewards. Then we come to recognition. So this is a special kind of reward, right? It's also a reward in and of itself. So an authority figure singles out an individual or team and holds them up as exemplary with regard to how they work or what they have accomplished. And distinguishing particular people for recognition carries with it some real hazards. So first of all, she says that no one is perfect, and shining a light on their accomplishments also opens them up to scrutiny by their peers with regards to their weaknesses. So the purpose of the reward is lost. And she says, second, no one does anything alone. So when you're recognizing an individual or a team, the business is disregarding the work of everyone else who has contributed to their success, and this can lead to jealousy and competitiveness. And she says that this also leads to generic behaviors where you're sort of, emphasizing a certain set of qualities that are desirable in the company, and this can lead people to abandon their singular qualities that make them unique so that they can be accepted in group norms. But she says that for passion and drive, people need to focus on their singular qualities. Then role modeling, she says, is based on identifying a living example of someone whose way should be emulated. And she says that companies who adopt it as a primary management practice think that it's a way to develop leadership, right? But she says that role modeling again leads to a generic workforce where it feeds unhealthy forms of grandiosity, and it sets them up to imagine that they can be superior to others, and that's never good. Rating and ranking is sort of the baseline on which rewards and recognition and role modeling are all built, right? So all of these come from here. And she says that this is carried out against a set of standards and a set of expectations established by the organization. And she says that when you sort of incentivize this, again, unique identity and passions can be given up by people. And this doesn't lead to anything good in terms of performance in the long run. And then we have performance reviews. She says that this is also an idea that comes from feedback and standardization. And this starts from the assumption that the only way for workers to get an accurate view of their performance is to have other people tell them what they're doing. So performance reviews are also backed by incentives and punishments, right? That if you get a bad review, then you'll be punished. If you get a good review, you'll get an incentive. And so people will want to have standard behaviors. Then people will strive to have standardized behaviors and not think originally or creatively, or think outside of the box. Then we have market research and customer feedback. So this is also something that she says these arose from local, as businesses grew into companies, they couldn't maintain long-term contact with their customers. So market research allowed companies to identify their needs and desires, and this led to product development and overall led to the improvement of certain initiatives. But she said that now the practice has evolved in a sophisticated way where you can get ethnographic information, you can get various kinds of data and direct feedback. But she says still, market research, you're applying a behavioral psychology to customers because you're assuming consumers are like animals moving around, and you can get information on them. And she says that consumers will tell you what annoys them or what they want right now, but they are usually never able to articulate what they aspire to achieve. and what might help them get there. So she says that most of the kinds of information you get from surveys doesn't really translate into sales. And she says that the secret is that market research makes people lazy because you're not thinking in a deep way about customers and where they're going in their lives. And you're getting useless information for customers and you're making expensive decisions that aren't good for your company. So she says that it's better to have a deeper understanding beyond just research about your customers instead. And universal training is, she says training is a good way to build skills for building skills. When you adopt a new software program, right? Or in our case, when we maybe take up AI. But she says training is not appropriate usually when it comes to the development of human creativity, motivation, or agency. So training is not going to help you achieve that. It can help achieve other things, but training is more mechanical, and education is different. So training is not necessarily always education, which supports unique capabilities. And so she says an innovative organization or a regenerative business needs to create conditions within which true education can take place. That needs to happen. And then finally, we come to the human potential paradigm. This is the last one. And this one says that basically, um, self actualization leads to internal motivation. And she says this comes out of the human potential movement. We've looked at this before as well. Um, she says that the problem with this sometimes is that humans need to be the authors of their own choices and actions, right? But a lot of the people who were taking up this human potential paradigm didn't understand that. Instead, they took the concept of human development to be a replacement um, for what is called performance. So, as a result, the programs that they were developing from the human potential philosophy were more or less similar to behaviorism. And, and this resulted in building practices that again weren't helpful. So, surveys are one thing that she says aren't the best because that it's another feedback process and it can lead to superficial reactions rather than actual reactions. So they can usually be superficial and they're not helpful. She said typology of personality, this is something that she talks about. She says this is a way for companies to manage complexity. So she says this shows up when we think of people as self-managing individuals, right? Um, they're classifying people based on personality or psychological traits like introverted, extroverted, analytical, so on and so forth. But she says typologies ultimately simplify the diversity and changeability of human expression. And again, is a simplification and it's not a good way to manage complexity. So it simplifies too much. Then participatory ideation is something that seeks to promote an atmosphere of inclusiveness by getting the opinion of employees. Like, suggestion boxes or memos for responses. But she says that this falls apart because um, it, it it doesn't allow the company to make decisions or take action that's helpful. Employees can contribute their thoughts, but they can't really take a lot of responsibility for the decisions that are being made. And then she talks about instant potential. So this derives from the idea that everyone can rise to almost any occasion. But she says there's a strong element of it's unrealistic because people think that you know it's like a switch that is your potential is on off switch, right? That it's open ended and it needs to be developed over time. So you can't just throw people in the deep end and traumatize them and sort of tell them that, now you're going to grow into your potential. You have to commit to developing human potential. You can't commit to just utilizing it, she says. Then visioning. Visioning, she says, taps into like the frontal lobe of the human brain because she says visioning allows you to project thoughts into the future. But she says visioning processes can be a bit toxic sometimes because visions occur in the minds of individuals, not in groups. And we need to translate individual visions into collective statement because the diversity of interpretation needs to be understood. And she says that we need to invite people to contemplate a better world because visioning processes implicitly start from what currently exists and ask people to improve on it. And visioning processes fail to address reality because they're framed around questions about what kind of future people would like to see. And visioning is based on the desires of individuals, right? So it can be an individualistic practice sometimes. And she says instead we should engage in a process together. We should engage in a process of imagining who we wish to serve and how we wish to serve them. Then institutional ideals again offer an aspirational measure of behavior, a pattern for people to emulate, and what is the ideal, right? And she says that principles and ideals don't really cultivate any kind of inspiration in people, and ideals are fixed ideas as well. Human-centered design is also something that grew out of the recognition that older paradigms weren't really that helpful and that it was leaving higher needs of human beings out of it. But she says that even though this is a good thing, human-centered design leaves out one of the most critical aspects that are needed for an innovative work culture, and that's the focus on stakeholders. So human-centered design is focused inward, right? That as long as we keep our people happy, everything will fall into place. But inward focus limits the amount of meaning that work can provide. You need to think about people outside of yourselves. So people outside oneself, that can be damaging. And we have a few more slides to go through, but we're almost at the end. And so how do you actually design developmental organization, right? So she says a couple of things, that you need to develop whole human beings. You need to design whole human beings, right? And she says human development comes through education. It doesn't come through instruction. And we need to do this by introducing frameworks that challenge people's habitual thinking. So we need to promote a kind of critical thinking in people. So our education programs need to push people to the limits of their thinking. And when people come to an educational session, he says they need to be working on real business endeavors, and they need to implement what they've learned and planned when they come into these. And she says she calls these cold storage training programs. So you're teaching skills that will be used at some time in the future. And she says that the development of people is tied to their ability to make a difference in the lives of customers. So we need to help employees connect their thinking to what's good for customers, and that's the whole process of the educational session. Then she says that there are also phases in the work design, right? That changes can happen when you're implementing something like this, right? That phases can unfold sequentially over time, right? But we need to also think of phases as sort of placed inside each other. So from one phase to the next, right? And as people are working on one phase, they're setting the stage for the next phase. So we need to think of it like that. And she says that there are no recipes to this, that this is not something you can just apply, off the shelf, that you need to think about what is it is a creative path, and it's unique to your own organization, how you set out to do this. And she says that the phases that she describes of the work design are from her own experience, and they don't need to be the same in one's own business. And she says that as long as you're paying attention to the developmental processes that you're undertaking, like, you'll be fine. She goes through like these phases, like there are 3 phases, and she says the first is strategic disruption, right? That the first phase of any work design is to destabilize the organization, so you become destabilized because you're being very provocative by these ideas, right? And this causes people to think from new perspectives, and this is a shock, a conscious shock for people. It's conscious because people are remembering the purpose of their work. It's a shock because people realize how conditioned they are to these normative business practices. And it's usually a question that you ask your team, and it leads to a kind of shock of what else could be happening. And a successful shock challenges familiar routines and places people outside of their comfort zones. And she says it takes time to introduce this shock across the entire organization, and you need to set up a core team whose business is to grow, whose purpose is to grow the business, who can do this. So the first step of this core team is to dismantle the tradition of hierarchical decision making. So no more hierarchical hierarchies, hierarchical decision making. And this requires a lot of courage from the leader. And the core team's role is to keep the organization and its people awake. And she says that the core team needs to learn how to think strategically and channel this new knowledge into transformational change. She says that usually people find it hard to understand, but more and more, like over time, they can take up more complex challenges and they're actually excited. And she says that there's a lot of courage involved here. And the core team needs to ask certain questions like where did we come from? Where should we be going? What is the essence of our organization? What are our values? What are we trying to do with in society? And so on and so forth. Then we come to part two, which is like a courageous culture. So she says that the culture of an organization holds patterns of beliefs and that dictate behavior. And she says that this can make a real to make a real change in an organization, we need to change its culture. We need to create a new culture that we need to change the ways in which we work, right? In every activity, in every day, right? Of every day. So deep culture creation happens through experience, education, reflection, not through imposition. Um, so you can ask core team members, to take what they've learned into their working teams, and they can develop a capability to make decisions based on the direction and character of the company, which benefits trying to improve customers' lives. And she says this gives people an incentive to do more. But she says a regenerative culture has various qualities, right? Um, and this includes, not being afraid of uncertainty, having a purposefulness, having the means to develop people's capabilities. Regenerative thinking, she says, is a rigorous discipline, and it demands that people concentrate as they seek to understand what is the core of how something works. There needs to be unifying strategy, that people need to have a shared focus in the business. There need to be self-to-self relationships, self-to-self relationships. So it is critical, to work together regardless of background, experience, or education. There are no hierarchies that are very traditional. So yeah, these are the various qualities that need to be there for a regenerative culture. And you need to also, according to her, evolve people and thinking processes. This is like the other phase that comes out of all this. So process refers to how people think, right? According to her, how people think, how people act, how people interact, and that processes occur in real time within the changing circumstances of the real world. So um, they're not procedures, but um, they're alive, and they're based on what's happening in the moment. Procedures are predetermined, so those are different. And she says that um, there are some essential business processes, right, that are necessary. So according to her, the world is changing continuously, right? So every new situation presents a business with a new challenge. And she says that the first thing is hiring. Hiring is a regenerative business, is always reciprocal. So its purpose is to examine the potential match in a way that enables both parties to kind of work together. And is it possible to have a developmental relationship with each other? So she says the interview is a conversation, that this is a way to understand connection. And if hired, the employee will likely find ways to express their own potential and make a contribution. She says that working in most companies means following a job description in order to perform tasks. But she says in a regenerative business, working is a creative process. So, working is a creative process undertaken by a team based on the goals it has set and the strategies that is helping it pursue its challenges. And this collaborative experience is what is needed. Then she says disciplining in a disciplining regenerative business avoid the need to discipline by helping them build self-discipline. So this is really important. And she says that a conventional business manages outputs by partitioning people in a team, right, or in a business. But a regenerative business, teams take responsibility for the effects um, as far as they're able to see those effects, right? They look at the customers, and beyond. And this is how they look at outputs in the long run. Then continuing education, she says most companies want to train people, but she says that in regenerative business, educational activities are developmental. So, like we've looked at before, they support people to develop the qualities that they have, like self management, critical thinking, embrace complexity and conflict, and so on. Then she says businesses should celebrate accomplishment, but accomplishment is the evolution in the capacity of a system to serve its purpose. So it becomes possible when a team has the courage to take on something they never be able to figure out before. So it's the purpose of accomplishment is to strengthen the bonds, right, in a community of workers that have that are trying to serve a certain purpose. And the last phase according to her is the evolved business work systems. So once she says a business has a strategic direction for itself, it started to grow new culture, has transformed its key processes, it'll get comfortable in its own skin. So at this point, it will need to redesign its systems and structures to better serve the role it has chosen to play in industry. So she says organizations create systems to keep multiple people and functions aligned. So they have a shared purpose, right? And she says systems become anti developmental when they drive organizations' decisions rather than serve the decision making processes. So she says that systems should provide the freedom for people to engage their personal agency and to serve their customers. So she says there are different kind of systems. There are managing systems that work on increasing the value generated when you are in a reciprocal exchange with the external world. So that's what she calls an exchange. When a business is increasing value, it has engaged in some kind of exchange with the world. Um, then she says site systems work on interacting, material, equipment, and people, everything that is needs to work together for operational work. So she says that um, a, a, a regenerative business has a consciousness of these flows, that everything has a certain flow to it, and we need to manage the movement and interactions. So, and the flows are managed in a way so that wasted effort is removed and it's effective and flexible. So you need to let go of what exists and you need to understand what actually works, and discover how something else could work differently. Then operating systems work to improve performance in the organization and build an effectiveness, right? And produce intended results. But she says operating systems need to take into account again, what are the results that we can expect when a customer uses our services. And we need to produce the customer's desired outcome. So it's all about the customer here as well. So we need to work as a team with customers as co-creators. And then personal systems, she says, work on growing people as a way to evolve the development and expression of the organization's potential. So this is different from a job description, so which is designed to slot people into existing positions. So she says that this allows personnel systems allow people to chart their own developmental paths and helps them understand complexity. And planning systems lay out the work that needs to be done and then ensures that this production stays on track with regards to strategy and budget. And it also means understanding if the business is creating results that will deliver the profound improvement in the lives of customers. And she says it's not enough to check off boxes like goals and benchmarks, but the organization needs to continually evaluate whether these goals and benchmarks are actually making a difference. This is what matters, right? And she also says that the last stage is work structures. And she says, so there are phases basically. And she says structures are useful when an entity needs stability. So there's three kinds of regenerative structures: developmental thinking, generative, and manifestation. So developmental thinking structures shape and direct our mental processes. They allow us to become conscious of the way our thinking is structured and allows us to reshape it. Generative structures enable a company to transform itself from something static to something dynamic by disrupting familiar ways of work that are outdated. And um, she says that the core team is usually the one that's trying to understand the dynamic world and trying to understand how they can have a meaningful impact. So a core team needs to reflect the perspectives of the organization's members and stakeholders, so that when they go into a room, they have the intelligence of the entire organization with them. So these are generative structures. it allows you to remain dynamic because you're getting information from everyone in the organization and from the buyer class. Then manifestation structures direct the flow of decisions, outcomes, and accountability so that the daily cycle of work can get done. So business leaders have made a promise, right, to the board, to investors, and they want their commitment to be translated. So they need to establish a level of control that allows their people to make appropriate decisions. And she says that workers are expected to be self-motivating, self-managing, right, and conscious of the whole business. And she says in conventional reporting structures, there's a hierarchy, right? That there are plans, procedures, standards that you provide to lower levels. But she says that in this case, right, individuals and teams are accountable for their behavior based on mutually agreed upon structures. And then finally, we have the epilogue. The epilogue is just a recap of everything that we've studied. And she says that, all of this might seem really daunting. And it is because it's very new, it's very different. But she says, and it can even be overwhelming, right? But she says that she does want all of this to be comprehensive. And it's, at this point, you might be thinking, how do I even begin? And she says the first step is always to become aware of the paradigms that lie behind decisions and actions and to evolve those paradigms. So she says that the various paradigms she's talked about, performance improvement, human growth, and systems regeneration, are the first place to start. And she says that you can't see people as fixed. That's the first thing. And you need to evolve your own thinking and the thinking of others in your business. And she says, but all of this becomes much more powerful when you do all this in a community. So discussing her book in a group setting, right? And discussing what kind of ideas it raises. And she's very democratic. She believes in democracy, so she makes a case for how she's been trying to push for democratic institutions in this book. And that is mostly sort of the way in which she concludes that all of this that we've learned needs to be discussed in community. And so ultimately, this is the regenerative paradigm.